Thank you for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on social media handles, which on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. But tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Antoine Wilson and Yi-Yoon Lee. Antoine Wilson's work has appeared in the Paris Review, Story Quarterly, Best New American Voices, and the Los Angeles Times, among other publications. He is the author of the novels Panorama City, The Interloper, and his newest novel, which we'll be talking about tonight, Mouth to Mouth. In a first-class lounge at JFK Airport, our narrator listens as Jeff Cook, a former classmate he only vaguely remembers, shares the uncanny story of his adult life, which changed course years before the moment he resuscitated a drowning man. Upon discovering that the man is renowned art dealer Francis Arsenault, Jeff begins to surreptitiously visit his Beverly Hills gallery. Although Francis does not seem to recognize him as the man who saved his life, he takes the younger man under his wing, initiating him into his world where knowledge, taste, and access are currency. A world where value is constantly shifting and calling into question what is real and what matters. Mouth to Mouth masterfully blurs the line between opportunity and exploitation, self-respect and self-delusion, fact and fiction, exposing the myriad of ways we deceive each other and ourselves. Wilson will be joined in conversation by Yi-Yoon Lee, the author of 8 books, including Where Reasons End, which received the PEN Jean Stein Book Award, and her most recent Tolstoy Together, 85 Days of War and Peace with Yi-Yoon Lee. She is the recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship, Guggenheim Fellowship, and the Wyndham Campbell Prize, among other honors. This evening's event will also include an audience Q&A, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Lastly, support Antoine and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his book from us. A link to buy Mouth to Mouth along with Yi-Yoon's books will be shared in the chat a couple of times tonight. Mouth to Mouth is currently a Powell's Pick of the Month, and check out the recent Q&A we did with Antoine on the powells.com blog. All right, Antoine and Yi-Yoon, we're thrilled to have you here, so thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Well, hello, congratulations. I want to show just quickly my copy of the book with the stickers matching the cover color. And
I love it.
Thank you. It's a fabulous book. And I've been thinking, before I came here, I was thinking, this is such a masterfully done book. In like any way to talk about it would be like, this is a great puzzle. You have to put the puzzle, apart a little. And I would hate to do that, but I think I will do that just a little bit. So
I
you
love
just
that.
have
Yeah.
to forgive me. But
No, that's what I want to do all day long, basically.
oh, okay. So I'm just going to put apart your
pull
puzzle.
it apart.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, can we, we just heard the description of the novel, but can we hear from your words how you would describe the novel?
Oh.
I know it's always difficult.
I mean, at the core, since he already mentioned the sort of narrative structure, at the core, the story is Jeff Cook's story, and it's from right after college. He's going through a period of heartbreak after a bad breakup, and he heads down to the beach in Santa Monica because he can't sleep, watching the sunrise. And there he saves a drowning man who turns out to be a famous, well-known Beverly Hills art dealer. And after that, quote unquote, heroic act, Jeff is left on the beach just with a woolen blanket and everybody's gone. And Francis doesn't know that Jeff saved his life. And Jeff feels that maybe things aren't complete. And he starts to wonder about the man he saved, and maybe about his own sense of agency in the world, because he's sort of a freshly hatched doofus in a way. that's not a very good description of the whole book, but to me, the core of the book is Jeff's story, but the structure of the book is the narrator bumps into Jeff at the airport, and they haven't seen each other for almost 20 years. And they sort of knew each other in college. And Jeff, who's now very fancy, and the narrator, who is a little schlubby, they end up in the first class lounge where Jeff basically buttonholes the narrator and tells him that story of his rise. So it comes filtered through
The narrator.
Jeff's voice. Yeah.
Yes. You know, it's funny because it starts with Jeff saving Francis' life. And when I was reading this, I was thinking very hard if I ever saved someone's life. And I actually did not think so. And I thought, what a fascinating idea. You know, when you save someone's life, there's that connection between you and the other person. That connection probably is as deep as if you murder that person. So I want to hear the origin story of this novel, because yes,
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
saving life and murdering are two fascinating topics.
for sure. You're right. We give and we take away. I've always been interested in this sort of relationship between rescuers and the people they rescue. And my father was a surgeon. I was pre-med. I worked as an EMT in college, and I was involved in resuscitating a person at one point who subsequently died like a half an hour later. So that was very strange. But the sort of story of this book I was visiting Seattle with a couple of friends in 1997. We were down by the waterfront, and there was a guy walking along, air drumming, listening to headphones, just do. And I saw he was just about to walk in front of a full-size train that just was running on tracks right there. And literally he would have walked in front of this train. So I managed to get his attention and stop him. And he was sort of looking back at me like, why did you stop me? And then the train went by. And he just looked at me like, and he said, oh my God, you saved my life. I'm going to buy you a big steak dinner. That's what he said. And then the train finished going by, and he just kept walking and air drumming. And that was it. And my friends made fun of me for years about not getting my steak dinner. And about 10 years ago, when I was exploring a few different things, that story came back to mind. And I thought, what is this relationship? What if somebody saved somebody else's life? And I was playing around with who these two people could be. And, what if the life that's saved is somebody that is sort of questionable, or maybe even a toxic person? So I played with versions of that to the point at which, I was hitting such a wall. I even tried to write it as a play. And that's when I realized I actually knew something about fiction writing, because I sat down to try to write a play and realized I knew nothing about playwriting. And so various versions and iterations over the past years finally yielded this relationship between Jeff Cook and Francis Arsenault.
Yes, the lesson, if you owe someone a steak dinner, just buy him the dinner instead of being written into the novel, right?
Yeah, right. Well,
that's your writerly revenge.
But then, but if you think about it, right, he takes you to the steak dinner, and if you're, then you say, you know what? How about enough? This was great. Let's do this again, right? How many steak dinners does it take to pay somebody back? There's this sort of things, sort of, as you said, with murder, things hit the extreme, right? They hit the asymptote, right, of value systems.
Yeah. I can we hear that the rescuing part of the book, because that's
Sure.
at the beginning of the novel, so we won't give away anything.
Yeah.
Just a
We can hear
short
the
reading.
Yeah, I'm going to read just before the rescuing part. So Jeff has woken up in bed and he thought his girlfriend was there because he heard her whistling nose, but it was his own nose. And so he's He's woken up pre-dawn and he's depressed because they're no longer together. And I'm going to change my glasses if you can believe it. Then so he makes his way down to the beach, and this is heartbroken post-collegiate Jeff. The sun was not yet up. From atop the bluffs, the beach was a dark gray strip, the ocean black. In the dark, he walked across the pedestrian bridge over PCH from one pool of light to the next. The beach lot was empty, nobody around other than a cyclist whizzing past, chasing an amber beam emanating from a box on his handlebars. The sky was a deep brown-black, low clouds reflecting the city's light back onto itself. A distant lump in the sand was either a nuzzling couple or a sleeping homeless person. The immensity of the ocean was already having an effect on him, diminishing the size of his problems, connecting him to everything elemental and all but eternal. He took off his shoes and socks, then stepped barefoot onto the cold sand, feeling a sense of liberation at his own insignificance, while also feeling, because he was alone, because it was dark, because the entire city lay behind him asleep, a sense of himself as a sort of local god, surveying his domain under a cloak of invisibility and omnipotence, two sides of the same coin. He sat at the water's edge, the dry sand just above the high tide line, and the cold seeped through the seat of his pants. He could make out the horizon splitting the view, the most distant visible thing on Earth. He fantasized about being dropped off out there halfway to Japan, treading water, succumbing to exhaustion. He didn't know then that from his vantage, the seemingly infinitely distant line was less than 2 nautical miles away. He was no better at estimating the dimensions of his heartbreak. With G, he'd felt like he was going somewhere, building a life, and now he felt like he'd been sent back to the starting line. As absurd as it would seem to him later, and actually impossible to recreate in his memory, to recapture the intensity of it, G's absence from his life felt unrelenting and ever present, the first thing he thought of upon waking, and the last thing he thought of before sleep descended. A glow simmered behind him, fiat lux, a slow reveal, coaxing sea and sky from the void, another day begun. Pelicans skimmed the slick water, the hazy outline of a ship appeared in the channel. Nearby seagulls squabbled over a piece of cellophane. High tide crests peaked but didn't break until they met the shore, ripples crossing the ocean from whatever storm had drummed them up. A rising of the water's energy passed from one molecule to another like a baton in a relay, transmitted all this way only to fizzle out on the sand. Just passing through, said a voice inside his head, source unknown, probably a bumper sticker. This happened sometimes. A voice or a song appeared in his thoughts, unbidden, but germane to whatever was going on in the moment, as if he didn't have one mind, but many, and his consciousness worked more like an orchestra conductor than a generator of its own ideas. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a dark form on the surface of the water. He was pretty sure it hadn't been there a moment before. A clump of kelp? No, a swimmer making for the shore, an arm slapping the water, then drifting as if scanning the bottom like a snorkeler without a snorkel, but then not. The swimmer undulated with the passing swell. The lack of muscle tension signaled to Jeff that something was wrong. He stood to watch, expecting the swimmer's arm to rise to slap the water again, or his head to turn for a breath, but nothing happened. He went to flag a lifeguard, but the towers were shuttered. Up and down the beach, there was only a single woman jogging, too distant to take notice. He hadn't yet faced a moment like this in his life, one in which he knew, with certainty, that the crisis at hand was his alone to deal with. One during which he wished for the intercession of the God he didn't believe in, or anyone who might know what to do, or even someone as clueless and panicked as himself who could, by their presence, share the burden. It was one of those crucial moments, one which, when reflected on, wouldn't be laughed off, but would send a chill up his spine, because even if he felt that he had no choice, that anyone would have done what he did in that situation, he would have to acknowledge that he was being tested, because in truth, he could have seen what he'd seen, could have subtracted himself from the scenario, told himself that he wasn't even there, that he'd left a moment too early or arrived a moment too late. that the predicament had not in fact fallen in his lap, but only grazed him as it passed, undisturbed and unaddressed, left to unfold by itself as nature might have intended. I pointed out that one's interceding or not could equally represent fate, that letting nature take its course could include any number of interventions since we ourselves were inseparable from nature. He considered this for a moment, seemed about to reply, and sipped his beer instead.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad you ended with that I pointed out and he conceded. So the one spectacular thing about the novel is the structure. And, you know, it's not like it's an old storytelling, you know, narrative method. You know, I was thinking about Gooseberry, Chekhov's story, right? You know, they had a swim, they ate a meal, they were all warm, they sat down, someone told a story. And, you know, Where's Pritchett, there's a story, Where's Pritchett, someone walks into a hair salon and the hairdresser started to tell the story. So there's that, you know, the storytelling mode, the narrative mode of one narrator telling the story to the second narrator. So by nature, there are two first-person narrators in the book. Can you talk a little bit about how you decided on that structure and why you feel attracted to that structure?
Yeah, so in the development of this story, of basically Jeff's story in earlier versions, I did have a sort of straight first person Jeff draft, and I could never make it work. And I wrote this along with another short novel, and I was like serially abandoning either one in despair. And the other one I finished, but it doesn't work. So it may be The Sacrificial Twin, but it was while working on that one that I sort of, I actually was rereading Austerlitz by Sebald, and this book is very un-Austerlitz-like, but I thought, wow, what if I filtered Jeff's story through a narrator, another narrator, and I just felt right. So I continued working on the other book, but I had a little, you know, a mental note. And so when I came back to this book, I started working on it like that, and everything just started to fall into place. And I think part of what I like about it is just like in something like The Turn of the Screw, right? Henry James is like multiple nestings. I find that it's this weird thing because you'd think that, you know, as a guy tells somebody else the story and so on, it undercuts the reliability in a way, and yet it reinforces the verisimilitude of it. Because it's coming filtered through somebody, but I don't know, somehow it makes it feel more real, more like it could be a true story, even if it doesn't check out.
Right. Yeah, I just want to show the cover to people, to the audience. And I think it's interesting, you said, you know, one is undercutting the story, but it makes the story more real. I just want to give my observation as a reader. I don't know how you did it because it was a puzzle, right? So I couldn't figure out the puzzle, but I could tell the audience, and I could tell you my reaction was, you know, I saw somewhere, I guess a review or catalog copy comparing the book to Patricia Highsmith's, you know, work. Yeah. And I was thinking, no, there's a little bit of a difference. So if I read Patricia Highsmith's, for instance, you know, Tom Ripley, I know the whole time how I react to Tom Ripley is I want him to get away from all these murders. So I know my position well when I'm reading her work. With your book, I thought there was some sort of like, it's a play with the anticipation or expectation of the readers. I actually don't know what I want because there are two narrators, right?
Mhm.
When I'm in Jeff Cook's shoes, when I'm in his point of view, like one thing as a reader, I know he's not entirely reliable, but I also
Right.
don't know what he wants, and I want to figure out what he wants, and
Mhm.
I also want to see if I can outsmart him, if I can get a step ahead of him, which I never get.
When you say what he wants, you mean what he wants in telling the story.
Yes.
Yeah, because the story itself, I mean, what he wants is this, right, this sort of.
Yes, but I think that is one thing that I don't think Patricia Highsmith did it, but somehow you like having this structure of one person telling another person's story.
Mhm.
I'm constantly trying to figure out what's Jeff's, and then the other part is I am actually in the first person narrator's shoes. I'm being held hostage by
Right,
Jeff Cook.
right.
And there are moments I was just like, as the narrator, I just want to walk away from this storyteller because, I don't want to hear him talking. I don't want to hear his story, but I do.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know how I want, this is my observation, but I sort of want you to tell me how you did it.
Yes. Sure.
Or when you were writing, how did you adjust, or how did you measure the distance between each narrator to the reader?
Right. Well, I mean, something that's interesting structurally that we haven't really talked about is that when, there's stuff that happens in dialogue and then it cuts away essentially the next chapter. And so then that's in a close third person, which is not sort of presented as the narrator's writing the version, but you could, look at it that way. But it's sort of almost like, okay, cut to the film. And that close third person is traditionally reliable. But it's, I don't know, I kind of like the way that it presses up against knowing that it's coming from this potentially questionable source. In terms of how it came together, I mean, if I have any strength as a writer, it's probably that I'm really good at cleaning up afterward. The way that it's really, I don't even know how these things come together, but by the time they're finished, I've sort of, it's like I've painted the floor and I just come right out the door and shut the door, so you can't hopefully see my rampant despair and creative flights and other wobbles in the paint. But it just came sort of naturally to me. It really appealed to me to have a static scene where I could return to. And so there's this dynamic between them sitting in the lounge, and they really don't move much. I mean, the narrator goes to the bathroom or he goes and gets a drink or whatever, or goes to check on the flight. But it's a very static scene. The book starts with "I sat," but then the story that Jeff's telling is somewhat propulsive, and it's this rather quick rise with its own tensions and sort of plotty things happening in it. And I like that dynamic. And I also like the chapters came out fairly short. That just felt, I mean, a lot of this was just on intuition in terms of how, when to cut away from them sitting there to another piece of the story. But there's this sort of little motion where they're sitting and then now we're in action and then back to their sitting. And in those moments when they're just sitting, there's a little room for breathing and interpretation, but it also gives me a chance to leap forward in the next, action-y section. So I felt like I was able to cut out a lot of the fat. Like this book is fairly thin in length, fairly short in length because of what I was able to cut, not because it only sort of came out that long in the first place.
So did you write them out and cut them?
No, I
just cut in your head.
I just, by the cuts, I mean the earlier drafts, earlier versions of Jeff's story and that kind of thing.
Right.
In terms of switching, when to cut away.
Mhm.
No, I kind of just felt my way there. And then I fully expected my editor to say, okay, this is great. This works, but here are the places where you should go back to dialogue, or here are the places where it might be better to stay in scene, or don't cut away here. And that didn't happen. So
Mhm.
I felt like I got away with something.
No, I think as I said, it feels like a puzzle. You just got it all in shape and everything in place, and it's just amazing. And I want to come back to the setting, the static setting of the lounge. I think there's something about the temporal movement and the static spatial setting or physical setting.
Mhm.
And can you talk a little bit about, because there are two timelines, right? In the lounge, it's a real life timeline. And
Right.
they're waiting and nothing happens. They're just waiting. And then
Right.
there's the timeline of Jeff's life story.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about just how the two timelines intersect in the novel?
Well, I think in terms of the waiting timeline, I love the idea of something sort of, like unfolding in real time.
Mhm.
And it just feels like if you want to simulate that, then you let it unfold in real time and then cut away and then return. And everybody understands some of that real time has passed. So, it's part of that illusion. But I just really like to slow things down. But then every time it goes into the third person, it's because some development has occurred. So those sections move more quickly. I don't know. I felt there was a rhythm there between those two speeds. And whereas the speed of reading probably doesn't change that much, because if they're in dialogue, you can go through that. It can feel, even though it's static, it can feel fairly quick because there's dialogue as opposed to chunks of text. And then the other stuff feels maybe like faster reading because so many things are happening.
Mhm. Yeah, and then there's the two timeline, and then there's the spatial setting. They start in the lounge, right? And then
Yeah.
later in the novel, Jeff and Francis and family, they're in the lounge, first class lounge.
Right. They have their own first. Right. It's his first time.
It was the first time, as
Yeah.
the narrator was never in the first. There's that little echo where the mirror effect.
Yeah.
And talk about
And
that.
well, I
Yeah.
think there's also, one of the sort of themes that is sort of way in the background, because it doesn't feel like it's central to the book, but it's there for me, was this difference between the narrator and Jeff. The narrator is taking all of these flights, and it's going to be a train ride, all this to get to Berlin because some magazine has called him a cult author, and he thinks he can capitalize on this and maybe make something, get away from his carpool and groceries and pretend to be just living this glamorous writer life. But he's got schlubby, he's got an old, JanSport type backpack. And Jeff is very slick. Jeff has the rollerboard suitcase. And so they're the same age, and they came from essentially the same place, but Jeff has stepped up. He's a first class kind of guy. And I just think in middle age, it's really interesting to look at those differences between people. And one might argue that Jeff is a sellout, although I don't know if he had anything to sell out. And that one might say the narrator's stayed true to his art or whatever. But in any case, I like this gap between the two of them, and this weird power that Jeff exerts over the narrator, even though the narrator could get up and walk away. It's not that big a deal, but Jeff treats him as if Jeff is the host, in this first class lounge, because he has invited him up with the pass. And I feel like that relationship is doubled in the story between Jeff and Francis, where Jeff is just, getting started, and Francis is Mr. Fancy art dealer guy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that power, between Jeff and the narrator. I think it is true. Jeff is holding the narrator hostage, right? On the
Yeah.
other hand, the narrator is playing God to Jeff's story,
Right. Right.
especially when the book goes into third person, close third, which is the narrator playing the God.
Yeah.
But the narrator, I'm just curious. I just want you to talk a little bit about that decision of this opaque narrator who is a little fluid, he's almost imprisoned in that
Yeah.
first class lounge,
Yeah.
but he has more freedom. He can tell the story, or he can
Yes.
decide not to tell the story.
Yes. In fact,
So
he says
he-
he's not going to.
Exactly.
And then
Yeah.
then there are reasons that he does, which we won't talk about. But he does
yeah.
declare that he isn't going to write it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, obviously he's curious to hear where the story is going to go. But yeah, there's this once it becomes clear that Jeff's story is a sort of self-portrait, right? Like a self-mythologizing self-portrait. And I'm of the opinion that Jeff believes his own story to a large extent, but I have left it very much open to the point that I think people could think him a sociopath. But I think the narrator does end up, having the power. And Jeff is aware of that the narrator is a writer and is aware that this writer might do something with his story, which I don't know if you've ever had people come and tell you, bestow their story upon you to say, you might want to write my story. But that's an interesting kind of relationship also.
I think that's one of the most disturbing relationships, right? Someone comes to you and said, "This is my life story.
Yeah.
I'm giving to you. You're going to write it."
Right.
And my instinct is, I'm never going to write your story. Never.
Yeah.
And the narrator claims that he's never going to. And yet somehow, in the end, Jeff gets what he wants. Jeff gets the narrator.
Well, yes, Jeff gets what he wants. Jeff is relieved of so many secrets, and his load is lightened, and he's told his story just like he'd like to be seen, and he steps off into the first class when they're called. And but then one could argue that by the end of the book, the fact that the book exists in a universe where this book is the narrator's book, one could argue that the narrator gets the win in the end.
I hope so, because we're writers.
Yeah, right. The writer wins. The writer always has the last word.
Win. No, really? I think the readers always have the last word.
Oh yeah. Well.
Yeah. But I do think that's such an interesting power dynamic, and I think particularly because the narrator is a writer, and because we do writing for a living, so I'm very aware that I feel used by Jeff in a way, and I just feel like the book is so like I'm being held as a prisoner to Jeff's story, and then I'm being used by Jeff. And then there's some satisfaction in that, in that position. So,
well, yeah, I mean, I think obviously we like to make fiction that leaves room for the reader, right, to co-create with the text, sort of thing. But on the other hand, we are fairly dictatorial in terms of the things that we create. In terms of where we want to take writers. This is not a video game, right? They don't have a choice in terms of what's on the next page. So it can be a really, we can create a velvet coffin for the reader sometimes. Pleasantly trapped.
Very, oops. Is that your, sorry, that's my computer. Sorry. Yeah, I just want to hold the book up again for the reader, for the audience. And there's a Q&A button, and we're going to, have audience to ask questions. So if you have questions for Antoine, please put into that box. And And I want to ask you about well, I wouldn't say inspirations, but like what books do you imagine this novel is having a conversation with? You mentioned, Zabald.
Yeah, I feel Zabald is like I'm reluctant to invoke him because I don't feel that this book is, other than having sparked the idea for the structure in my mind, it feels like a whole different universe to me.
Mhm.
That is really an excellent question that I don't know if I have an answer for.
Oh,
What other books it's in conversation with?
yeah, okay, I've been thinking about that too,
Yeah.
because
People, I mean, there's the Highsmith thing keeps coming up, which I think may have something to do with the sort of, I mean, obviously has something to do with Jeff's story being unreliable, and is he,
Right.
a Ripley type. But it's so interesting that what readers take away after they've read a book. You might have a handful of images and a bunch of like emotions and feelings, but you don't usually have like, you don't walk away with like the plot line in mind, at least, a few weeks later. So I find it interesting that there's, this, that it calls to Highsmith to people's attention. But that said, I've only really, I mean, I saw Purple Noon, and I never saw the Ripley movie, and I never read any Patricia Highsmith. So it's
That's
it's kind of one of
even
those things
better.
where I'm like, I think this is a really good, neat thing but it's also one of those things where I don't really necessarily feel like I can speak to it.
Right. It's funny because I do think what you earlier you said, this book actually gives the reader a spot in the narrative, which is different from my experience of reading Patricia Highsmith. I think it's different. Reading Highsmith is more just, I'm rooting for Tom Ripley.
Yeah, and it actually, I would say out of all my books, this one gives the reader the most air. And I'm sort of, it's funny because so much of this takes place, in the 90s, right? I saved that guy from the train in the 90s, but I also worked for a fine art appraiser in Beverly Hills in the 90s, and then after grad school in the early 2000s, which is where so much of the art stuff comes from. And it was also back then that I read the open work by Umberto Eco, and it just sort of sank its teeth into me, and it's been there ever since. This idea of, how much room can you leave in a work of art for the reader, the viewer, the participant. And I'm not an experimental avant-garde writer. But I also want to continue to push that limit, because I just find it interesting. I mean, it's difficult to do that and also be entertaining enough that, so
Right.
yeah,
No, absolutely. I don't think it's funny. No, you're not an experimental writer. You're a storyteller. And I feel like you're deeply, deeply attracted by storytelling, which, reminds me of your previous novel, this person telling the story,
yeah,
not to one person, to the cassette.
right, to the cassette, which is another thing. I'm like, the first book was a document, the second book was cassettes. This book has an interlocutor, and I'm just sort of like, am I living in the 1800s here? Like, I can't just address the reader directly. But I think you're right about the deep attraction to story. It's there, and then on a shallower level, maybe a more thinky level, I'm attracted. I read a lot of books that don't have a lot of story in them.
Yes, I know. I noticed that there are a couple questions coming in.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll ask the questions. And
yes, I need to open that.
It's from Lauren.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Lauren. Did you have Nick Carraway and Gatsby in mind at all when constructing this novel?
I'm trying to think if I ever did at any point. I mean, that it's the classic of American self-fashioning and witnessing of that self-fashioning. What a fabulous comp, Lauren. No, I didn't. Maybe maybe at some point it crossed my mind, but it was not in a profound way formative. Maybe I should have, and it would have been easier to write this, and it would have come out 2 years ago.
I'm so glad Lauren asked that question, because
Hmm.
when I was reading it, it did occur to me. I was thinking about Gatsby, but I also wonder if that's just the American attraction of self-made man.
Yeah, the self-made man, but also the self-made man with a questionable background. And Francis, also the art dealer,
Yes,
he's a sort of self-invention, right? He was
right.
Frank Busa. And oh yeah, the glasses. This is Lauren's daughter's writing a paper about this. I'm very excited to read that paper.
Very good.
They're also both this similar length. Maybe mine's a little bit longer, but they're both short novels.
Yes. And okay, so let me see which question. So let me ask this anonymous attendee's question. Was there anything you cut out of Jeff's story? If so, why?
I cut out it. I actually cut a great deal out of Francis's story and out of Chloe's story, Francis's daughter. Both Francis initially, because I hadn't landed on him as an art dealer. So I was trying to actually address what was the impact of having his life saved on him. And it was a different direction. My process, unfortunately, involves sort of starting at the beginning and going until my ship hits the rocks, and then I start from the beginning again, because I'm like, okay, that's not the way. And so I did go down some canals on this book. And another one was Chloe, in a previous draft, became a vehicle for my obsession with the horizon, and you get just a little tiny bit of the horizon in this, and so that's what I mean by the novel being a sort of compressed version of earlier drafts. There are these little tidbits that in previous versions maybe were big detours.
Okay. Well, you call it compressed edition or compressed version of earlier drafts. I thought it's a very disciplined draft or final product. And are there things you cut that you missed them, or you wish I know you always say you kill your darling or whatever that, are there darlings you missed that you killed?
I don't know, because it's part of the process, and this has happened in previous books, right? I don't like to cut and paste from previous drafts. So I'll work on a draft until it doesn't work, go back to the start without cutting and pasting, because sort of like whatever worked will stick, I think, in my memory. And then it also allows me to feel that I'm using the material of the book sort of spontaneously as I'm drafting, to give that kind of energy to the prose. But sometimes, yeah, there are little bits and pieces that I forget about, and I only see, years later if I've opened the wrong file, and I'm like, oh, that was a great line. And then I'll be like, did that make it? Was that? I mean, with Panorama City, there's a lot of those, because there's a lot of sort of aphoristic language, and sometimes there are some things that I missed. So on this one, I don't remember if there's anything that there's some scenes that I love, some passages that I love, but they don't belong in the book. So who knows what to do with them? They're dead darlings. They're dead darlings.
They're going to grow into another novel.
They're going to into the archive right here. Whoops, mirrored. There we go.
There you go. So Antoine, this is from Lauren. Do you see storytelling itself as having life-saving properties?
Yes. Yeah. I don't know if life-saving. I don't know if you could resurrect somebody with a story, right? That would be an interesting story. bringing somebody back to life by telling them a story. But I think the stories can be tremendously restorative. And if you are, in a deep despair, I think that the right stories can help bring you back to life. I mean, I think art can do it. Different art forms can bring, sort of snap you out of your habits of how you see the world and bring you back to life. And a story, I think a narrative can do that on a very, very deep level, if it's the right narrative. There are other stories that can, you can feel like they're taking your life away from you, depressing you.
Is Jeff telling the story to save his own life or sanity? I've been thinking about him a lot, just, because he's alive here in my head.
Yeah.
And I just have been thinking about how much he has rehearsed that stories.
Right, because it's been in his own head. And to some degree, right, there's this mouth to mouth is this thing that's been in his head, and finally he can get it out. And that, I don't know, I should say, yes, that it is a life-saving thing for him, just to be extreme. But I don't think it's quite that far, but I think it's a great relief for him to get this story out, because it's a story which sort of underpins everything, the entire his life, the way his life is right now. It's this little thing under everything. You could pull it out and it would be, Jenga. And so I think it's a great relief for him to get it out. And there's actually a moment when he and Chloe are in the 90s, a scene where she has a secret that she tells him she couldn't keep it for more than a night. And he reflects on the fact that he's got to keep his, as a result of her knowing her secret, he's now got to keep his secret for a lifetime, or as long as their relationship lasts. Right. Yeah. Right.
And I mean, I'm still thinking about Jeff rehearsing the story for 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
just amuse me. Like, if Jeff did not meet this narrator, he has to wait for another 10 years to tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
What would that story be?
I think it would be much the same story, but it kind of would depend on who he's talking to. One of the things the narrator observes about Jeff is that, and something that the narrator envies, but maybe only ironically in Jeff, is that Jeff has total faith in language. He believes that his story is a real thing, whereas, the narrator, being a writer, knows how inadequate words are, and how they never quite hit the mark.
Yes, I think that's the other thing the novel works really well, is there are cliches that are smartly used. So they're not cliches anymore, they're fresh. For instance, Jeff's relationship with Chloe. It is such a sort of like a, I don't know, it feels like a cliche relationship, but because of that secret Jeff has to keep. There's some freshness to that. How do you, because you mentioned 90s and 2000s, how did you incorporate the time? And
you mean why, like the era, why that?
Yeah, I think the words people use back then, the things.
Yeah. I mean,
the things we take for granted now, they still did not take for granted back then.
Right. He was working at the Web 1 startup company where back when search engines had actual editors working for them. I don't know. I just enjoyed stepping back into that time. A lot of my thinking about the art world comes from my experiences in that time. I didn't feel like I buttressed it with some reading and some research, but I wanted most of it to feel firsthand, so that's where all of that comes from. But it's interesting you mentioned Chloe, because my wife's one question
Mhm.
was, what does Chloe see in Jeff?
Oh.
Right? And I thought this is interesting. And so immediately I said, well, he's really good looking, right?
Mm.
And that's one of his qualities, which is a ridiculous but perfectly acceptable answer. And then you know, on the a little bit later, I realized, oh, she sees in him what he does not yet see in himself, which is that sort of mirror of her father.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's
So
very smart.
there's a
answer.
cliche, right? But it's one that operates in real life. So
Yes, but you know, it's not just, it's so very true. It's all just about the mirror and what you see in real life and what you see in the mirror. And just a very tiny question. The whole story is West Coast story. I mean, the novel is a West Coast novel.
yeah,
The telling is in JFK.
right.
How did that decision come about?
Two reasons. One, I wanted the narrator to be straight off a red eye.
Okay.
You know, and I was talk about a little darling, this image that's on the first page of seeing fireworks from above is one of my little images that I've been carrying around forever and wanting to put. It's sort of one of those things, did I ever put that in anything? And then finally, actually, yeah, it was linked with hearing a name over the PA in a document that I had from like 2001.
Mm.
So I love that image. And so I wanted the narrator to be taking off from LA in the evening. So that makes sense that he'd be on a red eye. And then, he's wonderfully underslept and schlubby. And then the reason for the flight delay is the eruption of the Icelandic volcano, Eyjafjallajökull. Yes. So, and I wanted them to be headed for Europe. So I don't know. It's also, yeah, they never really go outside in New York. Yeah.
Still, it makes us readers feel nostalgic for the time when we can travel freely.
Oh yeah.
We
I
can
know.
be delayed forever.
Right. And feel fine being delayed, where you're not just worried about your mask
Yes.
and all that stuff. Yeah.
No. Yes. Let me see if are there final questions from the. Yeah, we already answered that. So I know I'm not supposed to ask
Yes.
what you're working on at this moment.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to.
You can ask.
Yeah. No, I'm not going to ask that. I just maybe just one final thing, just to come back to the beginning when we talk about when you save someone's life, it's almost as deep as when you murder someone.
Mhm.
Yes. I read that I don't know if the audience have read that, the fabulous, profile of you in LA Times and about the murder. So I do want to hear about, the mirror, image of murdering someone and rescuing someone, saving someone, and how that is always your fascination with writing.
Well, yeah. I don't know. I mean, the profile, I think it's just always something that's been there in the background. And it obviously is what motivated the writing of The Interloper, or the concept. It sparked the concept that became The Interloper, and the question of what kind of is there humanity in everyone, and from a sort of whatever I am, Judeo-Christian, American, Canadian point of view, of course, that's what we all believe, right? And then on the other hand, from a sort of, I don't know, Darwinian biological point of view, there have to be some people who just came out wrong, right? They're just, and so, but I always find myself sort of shuttling back and forth on that line. In terms of saving a life, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's sort of on that line of playing God, but for Jeff, it's a shock. It's him discovering his sense of agency for the first time. And he also doesn't necessarily feel that it was a voluntary thing. He feels that he was almost forced into that position. So it's sort of a traumatizing thing for him. But yeah, I mean, obviously murdering someone is way worse than saving their life.
Well, but I like when you murder someone, at least you have that plot in your head. But when you are put in the position to save another life, how shocking that is.
Right, it's directional, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
like
the
you were
murdering is like the point of like where you lead your plot toward, whereas saving a life is where you're suddenly thrusted and then your plot moves
open
from
up.
it.
Yes. So
Well, you've solved why this book exists.
I feel the book is just so refreshing. It gives me so many thoughts about just how one incident would change so many lives. So
Yeah.
once again, I think I just want to hold the book up for everyone to see. And Antoine has a very good background.
There we go.
There's
I'm living in my end papers. And then somebody asked me, is that me on the cover of the book? It's not, but it could be.
Excellent. Thank you everyone for coming, and really do read the book. It's so thrilling and it's so exciting. And congratulations, Antoine.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for this totally stimulating conversation. I wish we could just keep going.
Thank you both. Yeah, thank you both so much for the conversation and for joining us tonight. And thank you everyone out there for tuning in. And please consider purchasing a copy of Mouth to Mouth on pals.com. And while you're there, check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you at another one soon. So thanks you both, and thanks everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Thanks. Good night.